Welcome to Briefing. I was recently hosted on the Classical Theism podcast to debate whether or not the captive bride verses found in Deuteronomy chapter 21 verses 10 through 14, if those verses are immoral and if those verses are inspired by God. My debate opponent was John DeRosa, and without further ado, here's our debate.
I'm joined today by Dana Harper for another interesting dialogue. He's been on the Classical Theism podcast before to dialogue about my book, One Less God Than You. And then we had an interesting discussion about the Gospels and the New Testament. And today we're going to have a little dialogue about an Old Testament passage. But before we get into that, we'll just have some brief introductions. The listeners, of course, you know me. I'm John DeRosa, host of the Classical Theism podcast, where we delve into apologetics and theology, defending Catholic Christian ideas in conversation. And we bring on all kinds of guests to help analyze different topics related to the faith. But Dana Harper, why don't you take a minute or so to introduce yourself to the audience again?
Sure. So I want to say this may be the third time that I've been on your podcast. And I'm kind of anticipating this might be the most contentious time that I'm on your podcast, too. So I hope we remain friends afterwards. But yeah, I'm a 60-year-old retired police sergeant. Just a little bit about my religious background. I currently call myself an atheist. I don't believe there's actually a God that exists. I became a family man at about the age of 27, and my wife kind of returned to her Christian roots with marriage and family. And I became a senior soldier in the Salvation Army, which is a church that I just found to be filled with honorable, law-abiding, and decent people who really cared very deeply about helping those with substance abuse problems. And the Christian lifestyle really fit my lifestyle. I had a lot of great Christian friends, but I always had this nagging question in my head. Is Christianity really true? I actually grew up in a completely, I guess you'd call us non-household. I don't remember having a single conversation with my parents growing up about God or religion or anything. So my first real introduction to Christianity was when I was about 27 years old. About 15 years ago, my kids grew up, moved out of the house. I got more time on my hands. I really wanted to know, is Christianity true? And I became fascinated with the study of the Christian faith, the Catholic faith, and fascinated with the Bible. But ultimately, my conclusion was that no, it's not true. It's a man-made religion. The Bible's not the word of God. And that's where I kind of stand today. I don't know where I'll be in 10 years from now.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate you coming back to have this discussion. I enjoyed our first two, and I'll definitely link to those in the show notes page for the listeners who haven't heard our previous dialogues. I found you reached out to me initially, and I found that you were a very thoughtful atheist who was willing to dialogue in these issues in a respectful way, even if at times it gets contentious or if there's disagreement, which is naturally going to happen. I thought you were a worthy dialogue partner and very respectful in both those debates. So we'll hold that high standard up for both of us today, even with this contentious topic. And here it is. For the listeners who haven't heard it yet, we're debating the proposition that Deuteronomy 21 verses 10 to 14 is an example of sexual immorality being sanctioned by and built into the Mosaic law, and that this text is not inspired by God. And Dana is going to take the affirmative position and say that that's true. I'm going to take the negative position and say that resolution is not true. And before we get to our opening statements, just so the listeners know the format, we each prepared about an 8 to 10 minute opening statement that we shared with each other before this dialogue. So we're both going to give our opening statements, and then we're going to have about 20 to 30 minutes of free-flowing discussion where we can ask each other questions about our arguments, clarify points, and see if we can get to the root of our disagreements. And then we'll end with 1 to 2 minute closing statements. So total time, we're looking at about 1 hour or so for this podcast. But Dana, if it's okay with you, I'm going to go ahead and read the passage that we're debating, and then I will turn it over to you for your opening statement.
Very good.
Okay, here is Deuteronomy 21, verses 10 to 14, and I'm reading from the English Standard Version. It says, quote, "When you go out to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God gives them into your hand, and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire to take her to be your wife, and you bring her home to your house, she shall shave her head and pare her nails, and she shall take off the clothes in which she was captured, and shall remain in your house, and lament her father and mother a full month. After that you may go into her, and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. But if you no longer delight in her, you shall let her go where she wants, but you shall not sell her for money, nor shall you treat her as a slave, since you have humiliated her." End quote. So that's the passage under discussion, Deuteronomy 21, verses 10 to 14. And I'll now turn it over to Dana Harper for his opening statement. You can go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay, well, thank you for the time, John. I am making the affirmative claim that Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 10 through 14, commonly referred to as the captive bride passages, are one, immoral, and two, they are not divinely inspired and have nothing whatsoever to do with a perfectly moral God. I am the one making this claim, and therefore I feel I have to prove this claim, and John doesn't really need to prove anything at all. He merely just needs to maybe punch holes in my argument. The captive bride regulations touch on two topics of an Israelite warrior's conduct. One, his conduct on the battlefield, and his conduct inside the home. Thus, the four captive bride verses touch on both the Mosaic laws, war, and family regulations. Somewhat of a bricolage, scholars might say. It's my argument the whole of the Mosaic law, including the captive bride verses, were fabricated by ancient, superstitious, and violent people. Again, I must prove that the captive bride verses are immoral and the God mentioned in them is fictional. I want to talk about what these verses actually authorize. The captive bride verses unequivocally, in my opinion, authorize kidnapping, false imprisonment, forced marriage, and rape. Christians react with disgust when they hear stories of the Quran authorizing Islamic men to rape their wives. Are we to hold the Bible to the same standard that we would hold the Quran? How do we condemn one ancient book and canonize another when both of them have passages of being able to rape your wife? Americans have a deep cultural and historic bias in favor of the Bible and in opposition to the Quran. This bias, in my opinion, eliminates American objectivity. Americans have a culturally ingrained presupposition that the Bible comes from God. It's my opinion that it does not come from God at all. It is solely the work of man. The motivations for these verses is sexual. These verses clearly provide Israelite warriors with sexual benefits forced from the desirable women of a conquered enemy. The sexual motivation is observed in the captive bride passages themselves. Verse number 11, if you noticed amongst the captives a beautiful woman and you desire her, you may take her as your wife. And verse number 13, you may go into her, which is an Old Testament euphemism for wedding night intercourse. The captive is forced into her situation. The evidence for her being forced is found directly in the passages themselves. Verse 11, you take her as a wife. Verse number 12, you bring her into your home and you have her shave her head, trim her nails, and put aside the clothing she was wearing when captured. Then you may go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. If you are not pleased with her, you let her go free. You must not sell her or treat her as a slave, since you have humiliated her. Nothing in these passages demonstrates the captive's consent is required. She is forced. She is taken from her defeated homeland. She is brought into the warrior's home. She shall become his bride, and she is humiliated on her wedding night. These passages are immoral. What is the evidence that these passages are immoral? First, I want to talk about the Catechism of the Catholic Church, section 2356, which defines rape. Rape is the forcible violation of the sexual intimacy of another person. And then a little bit later on in the same catechism, it is always an intrinsically evil act. Additionally, modern laws in respect to kidnapping, false imprisonment, and sexual violence would lead suspects found guilty of those crimes to lengthy, if not lifelong, prison sentences. People also instinctively react with strong negative feelings when they read these passages. Evidence from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, evidence from American legislated law, and evidence from people's natural reactions prove that the captive bride passages authorize immoral conduct. That immoral conduct is forced marriage and rape. The passages are not inspired by God. It raises a question. Might the true and real God, the actual creator of the universe, be angry at Christians for believing that the Bible is his word? Genesis accuses God of drowning his own children. The Pentateuch depicts God as commanding genocide. And the captive bride verses depict God as an accomplice to rape. The evidence of God's participation, his accomplice to rape, is found in the verses themselves. Verse number 10, when you go to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God delivers them into your hands, and you take captives, God delivers the enemy into the Israelite warriors' hands. God's participation sets the crime in progress. God's actions are the first actions in the timeline toward the captive bride's wedding night rape. God delivered the victims. He did it personally. God is a direct accomplice. Is this the real God? Is the real God going to be upset at the people who are calling these passages his word? The captive bride passages describe a God who lacks the leadership and courage to control the savagery of his own chosen people. The best explanation for these passages is very simple. They are not God's laws at all. Americans are taught that the Bible is God's word. American presidents take the oath of office on the Bible. There is a chorus of celebrity pastors demanding that Americans return to biblical values. If this cultural bias was removed and replaced with objectivity, we would see the Mosaic Law for what it actually is. The laws, ceremonies, and theologies of a fearful, ignorant, and barbaric people. The God of these passages was made up to support the ancients' fear-based ideology, to justify their actions, and to explain what they were observing but did not understand. If the captive bride verses are simply the ideas of ancient warlike men, they make absolute perfect sense. No reconciliation is required for anything. It's what we would expect ancient warlike men to write. However, reconciling the captive bride passages with a perfectly moral and all-powerful God requires the human imagination. Elements must be added to these verses which are not there. Other elements must be subtracted from the verses which actually are there. And the apologist must use a healthy dose of self-serving assumptions while ignoring assumptions that don't actually fit the all-moral God argument. I'll leave my summary to a simple question. Are these the inspired writings of an omniscient, omnibenevolent God who created mankind for a loving relationship? Or is this solely the ideological writings of ancient savage men? When we study the passages objectively, the answer becomes overwhelmingly clear. The passages are the writing of man. and the God mentioned in them is fictional. Yeah, that's my statement. I look forward to your statement and hopefully a engaging conversation.
Okay, thank you very much, Dana. I'm going to start the timer on myself, but thank you for that opening statement. And we're debating today whether Deuteronomy 21 is an example of sanctioned immorality and whether it's inspired by God. And as a faithful Catholic, I hold that all Scripture is inspired by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and training in righteousness, 2 Timothy 3:16. And since Deuteronomy 21 has always been considered part of sacred Scripture, the book of Deuteronomy, entire with all its parts, has been recognized as sacred and canonical at the Council of Trent. I hold that this portion is inspired. Yet, as Dana pointed out, in this debate, I don't need to prove the inspiration of the passage. He took the affirmative position and argued that the text is not divinely inspired, his main contention being that the text approves of the sexual immorality of an ignorant and barbaric people. And if I can respond to this charge adequately, then the inspiration of this passage will have been defended. In other words, shown not to have been wrong. And that's what I'm going to show today. That's what I intend to show, that Deuteronomy 21 is not an example of sexual immorality being commanded or approved of by God. And here's how I'm going to do that. My opening statement. First, I'll provide two background principles that I'll explain and defend. Second, I'm going to give an argument against Dana's reading of the text. And then third, I'll summarize a Christian reading of the text as I see it. So first, those two principles. Principle number one, our current worldview will significantly influence how we interpret the text. If one comes to this passage with naturalist presuppositions that God does not exist and nothing like God, then one is going to suppose the text must be merely human and explain it and concoct a rationale for its appearance on that basis. Since the text is viewed at the outset as non-divine, one will be more comfortable in reading it in an unfavorable way, perhaps highlighting elements that we find most repugnant and reading into them bad motives and assumptions on the part of the author. Yet, that's not how Christians approach the text. I hold that Deuteronomy is best described as a covenant document which contains speeches given by Moses to the Israelites under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. We've defended that in a few podcast episodes that I'll link in the show notes. So I'm more comfortable making an effort to read the text in a favorable way and highlighting elements that best fit with the Catholic Christian worldview and without assuming bad motives on the part of the author. So that's my first principle. Our worldview will significantly influence how we interpret the text. Second principle, and this one is really important. Just because the Bible regulates something doesn't mean God approves it. The Bible regulates servitude, polygamy, and divorce, which were rampant in the ancient world, but this does not mean God approves of those realities in an unqualified way. In the New Testament, Jesus reveals that Moses permitted divorce due to the Israelites' quote-unquote hardness of hearts, but this was not ultimately God's plan for marriage. See that in Mark chapter 10, verses 10 to 6. Hence, we know there were institutions or features of the Mosaic governance which God tolerated and regulated, yet without stamping them with divine approval. Consider an analogy to a 4-year-old who's being taught right and wrong from his parents. The child won't be able to grasp a sophisticated moral code at that young age, yet the parents can provide regulations and boundaries that are suitable to his current stage of moral development, revealing more and more of the ideal moral code as the child's able to grasp it. It would be silly if a parent was just to bark an advanced moral code at a 4-year-old who's not in position to understand it. I think the divine pedagogy can work in a similar way with God's covenant people. They had to grow up and learn God's ways over time, and, as the Bible tells us, when the fullness of time has come, Jesus reveals the new law, that we are to love God with all our heart and our neighbors as ourselves, and this includes all people, Jews and Gentiles. In light of this principle, it's plausible to read Deuteronomy 21 as God restraining or regulating the practice of finding spouses among captives. After all, what might men have done in the absence of these regulations? Perhaps they would have seen warfare as a no-holds-barred affair, where all kinds of sexual promiscuity or assault are permitted. It's no secret that during wartime, even the most righteous armies will have deviant combatants who stray from commands and commit war crimes. The text in Deuteronomy 21 provides regulations that rein this in. Now, what do these specific regulations mean? Some argue that the shaving of the head, cutting nails, and putting off former clothing are designed to make the woman less attractive. Others argue that these rituals are designed to strip the woman of her former pagan identity as she prepares for entry into the covenant people of Israel. The commentaries are mixed. The rabbis are mixed on this. And in the New International Commentary, the Bible scholar F.F. Bruce, and I actually just checked this last night, says that it's unclear the exact motivation of these passages. But I'll argue that both of those motivations, they're not mutually exclusive. God could have intended them as a dual purpose to make the woman less attractive so that this warrior better make sure that he really wants to marry her and take care of her, or also to strip away her pagan lifestyle and get her ready to enter into the covenant of Israel. Both of those things could be going on for the reasons of those rituals. But one cannot help see these regulations move toward a more humane treatment than captive women might have otherwise received. The Israelite male is not permitted to rape or assault the woman. If he wants to be with her, he has to marry her, and she receives all the rights and privileges of other covenant wives. Those are my two principles, that our worldview is important, and two, just because the Bible regulates something doesn't mean God approves it. Okay, next, I want to give an argument against Dana's reading of the text and then summarize my own reading. Here's the argument. Dana says these passages are best understood as the ancient writings of angry warlords who fictionalized a god to represent their particular beliefs and authorize their particular desires. But I think that position runs into trouble because of this argument. Here it is. Premise 1. If the text is written by angry warlords wishing to authorize their own sexual desires, then they would not invent strict regulations regarding espousing captive women. Premise 2. The text under debate contains strict regulations regarding the espousing of captive women. Conclusion, therefore, the text is not written by angry warlords wishing to authorize their own sexual desires. Now, why I think that first premise is true? Well, it follows from the idea that one would not willingly place major obstacles in the way of one's own goals. If the text was merely motivated by men aiming to satisfy their base desires, why create a 30-day or a month-long waiting period? Why require all those rituals? Why require marriage at all? Wouldn't it have been more fitting for their base desires to remove the regulations entirely and just say that God allowed the warriors to take the women however they wish, treat them however they want, and dispose of them whenever they want to? That would align better with the goals of immoral warriors. Yet, we don't find such debaucherous language, and instead the more strict regulations. And so it's more plausible to see this text as God's restraining the warriors rather than a sweeping authorization of misconduct. I'll close with a summary of my Christian reading of the text. So first, some context. In ancient times, people lived at mere subsistence levels of agriculture. They didn't have advanced economies or social safety nets to help the poor. Additionally, ancient cultures overwhelmingly endorsed slavery, polygamy, harsh child labor, and other practices we find repugnant today. Yet, Israel stands out with its laws that repeatedly insist upon protections for widows, orphans, sojourners, and aliens. Additionally, the laws of the Mosaic Covenant regulate slavery, polygamy, and other practices to restrain the evil that men would have carried out in the absence of such regulations. They are not the ideal. The Mosaic Covenant provides a scaffolding of temporary injunctions in which Israel grows up in relationship with God over time and which culminates in Jesus' teachings in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is the most authoritative rabbi we have in our Christian tradition, and we read the old laws as pointing to something better in him. Since Deuteronomy 21 can be situated in this regulatory body of laws that are not ideal, but provide protections and privileges for captive women who might have otherwise been treated in a disposable way, I argue that there is no strong reason to reject the text as inspired. The woman cannot be raped. She cannot be assaulted. She's given a set of rituals to bring her into the covenant people of God through which she can find salvation. What if she refused the arrangement? Well, the text doesn't really tell us what would happen. She would have to fend for herself. Would she have to survive in the wilderness on her own? Would she be a lowly member of society that would have to sell her labor to survive? There were very harsh conditions in the ancient world. In other cultures, maybe she would have just been assaulted and subjected to unrestricted chattel slavery. But in Israel, this is not allowed. She's given a path into the covenant people of God. And while these temporary laws were not the ideal, they provide reasonable and humane restrictions which exceed other ancient cultures in recognizing human dignity. Hence, I do not find these passages an approval of rape or other sanctioned immorality, and I do not see strong reasons to reject them as inspired by God. And that concludes my opening statement, but I do apologize, Dana, because I went about 40 seconds over 10 minutes. So I do want to be fair to the equal time aspect of this and definitely make sure I'll give you the last word at the end of the debate, and I'll give you plenty of time if you want to add anything to your arguments as we clarify and discuss things further. But if it's okay with you, we'll now enter into the opening dialogue. And the fun part about exchanging opening statements beforehand is we know the contours of our arguments, but we don't know exactly what points are, we're going to want to clarify and push back on a bit. So I kind of wanted to give the floor over to you first in any further points in your argument that you wanted to defend, or things in my opening statement that you wanted to critique, or just general thoughts on the matter of this difficult passage.
Sure. Okay, well, let me start out. 40 seconds over? This is outrageous. You get demerits for that, okay? 40 seconds. That's a long time, John. Listen, I want to start out maybe a little bit of a positive note on where we do agree about the text that does support your view of it. You did kind of mention and talked a bit about the Bible having some authority. Now, a lot of people in my position as atheists will argue the Bible has no authority at all. The Constitution forbids that, yada, yada. I disagree with that. I do think the Bible does, in fact, have authority, because upwards to 50 million to 100 million of my fellow citizens absolutely believe it has authority. So as far as America is concerned, the Bible might not be something that the courts, recognize or argue about, but it absolutely has authority in the United States because so many people believe in it. So it cannot be discounted. You also mentioned something I agree with, that sojourners and foreigners are protected. It's all over Leviticus and the Old Testament that, no, you're supposed to take care of these people who are sojourning alongside you. That I completely agree with. And I do agree that there is some restraint on the Israelite warrior. They do not get to do whatever it is they want. So we have some agreement on that. However, I'm not going to back off of my comments, but we do have some agreement. I think that the big thing I really wanted to straighten out is, in my opening statement, I very unequivocally and clearly stated this is rape. And in your statement, you seem to say, no, this is not rape. So I guess I want to ask, can you talk about that? Why to you is this not rape? And if it's not rape, what is it?
Good question. Let's spend some time there. And if you allow me to first, I'll just point out a couple of points of agreement with your opening statement, because you started out with some agreement with mine. I'm in agreement with you when you quote, especially when you quote the Catechism, that rape is intrinsically immoral, that these notions of kidnapping, false imprisonment, rape, things that you list, I agree that those are immoral practices, and those are not things that we want to approve. Another thing you brought up that I agree, they said, when the passage at the outset, it says, and the Lord delivers them into her hands. You're talking about God's action involved with this. I want to acknowledge that I agree that God is involved in this event of the Israelites conquering and going to war with various nations. However, I would caution against reading too much into that. As far as this, that could have been a description when it says, and the Lord delivers them into your hands. This could simply be a description of how God providentially guided the Israelites to victory in a battle. And the text describing the Lord delivering him into their hands doesn't necessarily presuppose like a specific supernatural action on the part of God, like he's going down there and throwing the spears and stuff like that. It just means that he can providentially guide them into victory in battle. But let's go to that central contention where you say that it is rape. Well, let me ask you this. The reason I don't think it's rape is, well, first, the passage doesn't say that the captive woman, that the man's allowed to do anything he wants with her. That's the first reason. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that he can rape her. And then the third thing I would point out is that in Deuteronomy 25, I know I don't want to jump around too much in this debate because I know it's very focused, but we do get what I see as a condemnation of rape. Now, Deuteronomy 22, and it's verses 25 to 27. And I can go to that and I can read that, but those would be my three reasons. Let's just kind of start there broad if we want to go specifically into those. That's the three reasons I don't see it as rape. One, it doesn't specifically say rape in the passage. Two, I don't see where it says the man can do whatever he wants with her. And three, I see a condemnation of rape in Deuteronomy 22, where maybe I can read that passage a little bit, but those are kind of my reasons at the outset. And let me say this as well. You did highlight the features that let me kick it back over to you. What do you think about that? And what are the features where you really hone in on that? No, this still seems like rape to you.
Yeah, well, okay, so I think that the ancient authors who wrote these had a very different opinion of what rape was than we do today. The ancient author, if we were having this discussion, would think I was out of my mind. What do you mean? I mean, I grabbed this woman off the battlefield, I followed the regulations, I married my wife, of course I'm going to have sex with her. They would just not even fathom this. I want to talk about the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It does, in fact, say it's intrinsically evil to use force to violate the sexual intimacy of another person. I would also, now it's a lot more the Catechism's teachings on the sacrament of marriage, but it's very clear from the sacrament of marriage in the Catechism that both spouses need to proclaim verbally, out loud and publicly, they want to marry the other person. My argument why this is rape is this woman has been removed from her homeland. She is alone. She is under duress. The passages call her a captive. She's a captive, basically falsely imprisoned by our moral standards today in the warrior's home. And she shall become his wife. It's in direct conflict with the Catechism's teaching on the sacrament of marriage because she's not verbally. There's nothing in this passage that indicates that her freedom or consent is in any of this. Without consent, sexual intercourse is rape. That's just what it is in my view, and really in America's view at this point in time. No, the ancient author did not think it was rape. But like scientific discovery, we get better moral values with time, and we now know and understand, oh yeah, when you grab a woman off the battlefield and you take her to your home and you force her to be your wife and she has no choice, and then on the wedding night you humiliate her, this does not sound like it has any elements of consent in it at all. Without consent, it's rape.
So, well, it doesn't say on the wedding night you humiliate her. That was something you just added. But what I would want to ask is, does it say anything? To me, okay, this gets back to the worldview thing. Where does it say that she doesn't have any choice in the matter?
Well, okay, so good question, actually, because I'm going to be accusing you of making assumptions, so it's totally fair to accuse me of making assumptions as well. I'm looking at the language that the ancient author used, that there's no language in there that indicates consent, and she shall become his wife. She is a captive. She is taken off the battlefield. She is forced to shave her head and trim her nails and to remove the clothing she was wearing while captured. It doesn't say that she has any choice in these matters at all. And so to make an assumption that she does have choice, I think you have to add things that aren't there. I am drawing my assumption, and I agree, it's an assumption, but it's based on the actual language of these passages.
would it be possible, consistent with Deuteronomy 21 and all that it says, that the woman is given some sort of choice at the outset of the rituals? And what we read in verses 12 and following are what follow upon her consent or acquiescence, because I realize you're right. Even if she does consent in some form of saying, yes, I will do this, like let's say that offered, there's a warrior who wants to marry you. And let's just say, hypothetically, on my assumption, that's an offer. And then she says, okay, you know what, looking around at her options, she's like, this is the wilderness. I'm a prisoner of war. What are my choices here? And she decides, under that duress, which you rightly point out, and some of that is just the harsh conditions of the fallen world, she says, yes, I will do it. And if that is given at I know this is not literally in the passage yet, but I'm saying, if that were at the outset of this ritual, would you then agree that it was not rape?
If the captive, like say on the battle, so I think that this is a situation that could literally happen and probably did happen in war. It's not uncommon at all. World War II being a prime example, is there were, as Nazi Germany invaded other countries, there were women who got with Nazi soldiers because they thought, hey, these guys are the winners. So yes, that same thing applies to these ancient women as well. I'm just saying that the passages don't indicate that. But even if some women were willing participants, their homeland was defeated, and they looked at the conquering Israelite as, hey, my life might be better off with this dude. That is absolutely possible. I would even go so far to say that could happen. But that's not what the regulations are about. The regulations are about forcing women, and it would not be 100% of captive women. I would think the vast majority of captive women, and I wasn't there, I didn't see it, we're doing some speculating on what happens in war, are terrified that their families have been killed by these warriors, and they're terrified of them. So just because, some captive women might have looked at this as an improvement to their lives does not excuse what the regulations say, in my opinion.
I don't disagree with that. My thing is, I don't think the text tells us what would happen if the woman were to refuse the arrangement. It doesn't give us any information about that. And so what I would just hold is that, consistent with this text as written, is that this woman is told that there's a warrior who wants to marry you, and she can go into the arrangement or possibly refuse the arrangement. I do have a little bit of evidence in another part of the Mosaic Law that I think supports that I can get into. But I guess that's another core reason why I don't find this to be rape. I see that you are pointing out part of the regulations where it says, okay, she shall go into the house, she shall trim her nails, you shall have her. But if at the outset there was an arrangement where there was some sort of consent, of course, albeit this is fallen, this is not the ideal, this is God restraining how bad things otherwise could be. But if there were at the outset some agreement to go about this, then I don't see that as rape. That's kind of where I'm coming from. Do you want me to give my little piece of evidence, or do you want to come back on that one more point?
Was this the evidence in Deuteronomy that you talked about, chapter 20, I think?
Well, no, it's actually different. And that's why I don't want to, it's very hard with these things to jump around.
Yeah. I don't know how you feel about it, but I feel like, hey, I got to say my piece on why.
Okay, you got to say your piece on that.
And you got to say your piece, so we could talk about it for the next hour, but
let's go to I wanted to see what you thought of my argument against your position when I said, so I'll save that evidence. It's from a passage in Exodus, but I don't want to get bogged down in the details. My argument against your strict reading was that, if this is just merely human angry warlords who want to act out their base desires, then why invent all these strict regulations at all?
Yeah. Okay. So I think that this is actually when we did exchange opening statements, and I kind of thought about that. I think this is a pretty good argument here. You're kind of using words like these regulations are not ideal or anything. I'm using words like, no, they're immoral. But to me, this is like arguing because some other culture's laws are bad, that then therefore makes, the ancient Israelites' cultures good. You could have a horrible law and then a really bad law, because one law is horrible does not make another law bad. It's like saying the Bible is good because the Quran is worse. So I'm looking at these passages and going, that's immoral. And I also want to talk a little bit about that this is not about just summarily raping some woman on the battlefield. There's some scholars think that they could have been doing that. I actually don't think that's consistent with the Mosaic law, that just raping women on the battlefield. I think the Russian military in World War II is accused of doing that to German women for sure, that they didn't have that authority. This is about seeing a desirable, beautiful woman that warrior wants to take home as his wife. And there's a lot of advantages for him doing this. He gets repeated sexual access to her. If her sexual prowess is sufficient to please that warrior, he gets to keep her, and he gets repeated sexual access. He also gets another wife, and he could have multiple wives. He might be interested in procreating more children. With more wives, you can get more children. Somebody to take care of his household needs. There's other assumptions that I'm reading into this, and I want to admit these are assumptions, but it's somewhat of a sexualized war trophy, and he's able to humiliate the enemies that he just defeated in battle. So for an Israelite warrior to see a beautiful, desirable woman and want to not just rape her on the battlefield, but to take her home and make her really kind of his property in a way, that's what these regulations, I think, are about. Getting that warrior repeated sexual access, the other benefits of a wife, and to assimilate her into Israelite culture. I'm kind of buying into that framework. But that's why I don't really like, this argument. Why are these strict? But I don't find the regulations particularly strict. I guess my counter question to you would be, what is strict about these regulations, and what conduct does it actually prevent?
That's a good question. I would say, first, the month-long waiting period, and also the shaving of the nails, shaving of the head, all of that sort. Whether this was the initial intention of the Deuteronomy passage to make them unattractive, I know Jimmy Akin brought that up in an episode that we talked about on the topic, whether that's definitely the intention, or whether it's also to get rid of some of that pagan identity. Whether it was the intention or not, it definitely does make her unattractive. So one, you're saying the warrior cannot have sex with the woman right away. He has to wait a month. Two, he has to make her,
I agree with that,
look much more unattractive. And so in my view, don't you think warriors would just prefer to not have any of those fences up? That is an interesting point you make about, well, it gives her the opportunity to take her home as a trophy, which might be considered more to a warrior who just doesn't, they might find that more prestigious. But don't you think there would have been some warriors who would have preferred just to have no holds barred access and just, hey, do whatever you want with them and dispose when you don't care anymore?
There are. I know Abu Ghraib, the United States military was involved in that. So obviously, now we sent those people to jail. I'm not really sure what happened to them, but I know they were prosecuted, and I know that the general in charge was thrown out of the military with a bad conduct discharge. What I actually believe the waiting period, there's speculation here. So what this 30 days is a little bit elusive, but it is very consistent with the Mosaic Law's mourning period. That the ancient author thought, hey, Moses was mourned for 30 days, as was Aaron. He's just being consistent with the mourning period of 30 days. I think that is probably the intent. I did want to comment on this unattractive thing, though. I feel that is speculation. So if you're going to speculate, I want to start speculating as well. I actually would speculate that it's potentially plausible that the captive woman is more attractive to the warrior. When she's taken off the battlefield, her clothing could very well be filthy. She's terrified at that particular time. She does have to shave her head, which I actually think is most likely because of Leviticus skin diseases, talks about shaving a person's head, but it's elusive. We don't know why the shaving of the head is there. The warrior chooses the captive's new clothing. Does he pick something that's acceptable for an Israelite wife to wear, something that he finds, appealing for her to look at? I think when she's cleaned up, she's in the clothes that the warrior chose for her to wear, and she's, getting assimilated into Israelite culture, it's possible she's actually more attractive as a wife and sexually to the warrior than when she was first taken off the battlefield. I'd also like to mention this is a cheaper way of marrying a woman under the Mosaic law. If you just grab them off the battlefield, you avoid the dowry and the bride price. You don't have to negotiate any money to the bride's father. You get this woman for free. So I think those are kind of points I would make about, if we're going to be speculating. But I kind of don't think you could say, yes, she would be unattractive with a shaved head. But there are other aspects which could make her more attractive and less expensive as a wife than were she not taken off the battlefield.
So you find it plausible that they would invent those regulations, is what you're saying?
I personally think that the shaving of the head, it could be related. Hey, let's make sure that this woman doesn't have any kind of, skin disease before she gets into Israelite culture. There are scholars that speculate that the 30 days is about making sure she's not pregnant, that before the warrior has intercourse with her, he really wants to make sure she menstruates and isn't pregnant with some enemy male's child. Now, I reject this. First of all, her menstruation is going to be completely out of whack. I'm not absolutely convinced that these ancient authors even understood menstruation like we do today. And then the distance from the battlefield to the warrior's home in 30 days, it gets to be probably not what it's about. But it's a speculative thing. What I really think it's about, the 30 days, is mourning. It's just the Mosaic law's common time period for mourning.
Okay.
I don't know if I got off track.
No, that's okay. I was going to bring us to one other topic. I wanted to make sure we had time to discuss, because, so we got your view on those regulations. We started out with you holding ground, saying that this would constitute rape, and I'm saying I don't think it constitutes rape. I agree that rape is wrong. But the third thing that we haven't really talked about a ton yet, now you actually did kind of allude to this, that saying just because the Bible's better than the Quran doesn't mean the Bible's good. And I wanted to ask what you thought of my central point, which is that these laws in this time and place of the fallen world, on the biblical worldview, are not the ideal, but could constitute God accommodating himself and working with his people as a small step in the right direction in various ways. Like we talked about, maybe some warriors would just want to have the woman and take her into his home and see that as better. But I'm sure some of them would just have wanted to do whatever they wanted with the women and dispose of them when they were done. And this law says, no, you can't do that if you're an Israelite warrior. It prevents them from doing that. It restrains them, it regulates them. And so I see this as part of a whole section in Deuteronomy, probably from chapters 12 to 26, which are issuing commands and codes that are regulatory, that are restraining, that are a step in the right direction, though still fall short of what God ultimately comes to reveal in Jesus Christ, which is that the law of love, the law of Christ, is that you got to love your neighbor as yourself, you got to love your enemies, and there's no room for any mistreatment of people, any unwarranted mistreatment at all. And so these are simply a step along the way leading up to that. And I'm curious what you thought of that take on the passage, because I think that was key to my argument.
Yeah, okay, so I'm not going to have a really great opinion of it, but I do admit, one of the great sayings of Jesus is love your neighbor as yourself. But this idea of God teaching people slowly over time, but Deuteronomy was potentially written 1,000 years before the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. So we have this 1,000 years of this time frame that we're dealing with to slowly teach people decent moral values. Listen, I started out in military service, and I've been in police service, both police service and military service for really 4 decades now, 40 years. And the level of leadership incompetence in taking 1,000 years to determine that, sexual violence is not the way forward is just astronomical to me from my, professional life. As to Jesus, though, this is kind of interesting. You did kind of quote Mark 10 in the first, but this is what I really think is kind of going on here is the modern apologists are, getting hit up by skeptics about these dark passages in the Old Testament. So they, go through the New Testament, specifically the words of Jesus, and they find what are really non sequitur arguments to kind of try and smooth over or reconcile some of those Old Testament dark passages. But Mark 10, Jesus' comments in Mark 10 have absolutely, when you read them, don't have anything to do with the captive bride passages or rape or forced marriage. They're totally to do with divorce and adultery. And Jesus is making this statement that, what God has put together, let no man tear apart. He's saying, look, God creates the sacrament of marriage. Nobody can tear that apart. And I think he's kind of in a very vague way saying you don't necessarily need to live with an abusive husband, but you can't go out and get remarried because that's adultery. That's what he's saying. I don't think it applies to the captive bride verses. To tell you the truth, I think if Jesus were to read these captive bride verses, he may not have known about them. Now, he did clearly know about the Old Testament. That doesn't mean you know about every scripture. But I feel he would have immediately said, oh, yeah, we're not doing any of that. That's what Jesus' reaction would be.
Can I respond to this?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Sure. No.
So I disagree that he wouldn't have known it. I think Jesus knew the Torah. But
right.
So here, this is a crux of it, because you do bring up a good point that he specifically is engaging the topic of divorce. But here's what he's doing that's interesting, and this is why Christian apologists, and I let myself in with that, apply this to other passages. Jesus says that Moses allowed divorce for your hardness of hearts, but from the beginning it was not so. Now here's the interesting thing. When you look back in Deuteronomy, the passage that permits divorce most explicitly, I think I have it up, is Deuteronomy 24. And in Deuteronomy 24, it speaks about when a man takes a wife and marries her and finds no favor and she finds no favor in his eyes because he found indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house. She departs from his house, end quote. That's just the beginning of a passage in Deuteronomy 24. It doesn't say anything that, this was just Mosaic regulations for a time. It doesn't say that this was done for their hardness of hearts. In other words, the way the Deuteronomy passage speaks about divorce is actually when it says this language of when a man takes a wife and marries her. You find this in a lot of places. When you go and buy slaves or servants, when you see among the people, among the captives, a beautiful woman. In other words, I think this language of when you see such and such, when you do this, when you do that, that similar language speaks to the fact that God is noticing what the Israelites are doing and putting scaffolding, putting injunctions, putting regulations in place of it. In other words, it's very important that it doesn't say in Deuteronomy, after it has one of these passages, it doesn't say, and this is the best way to do it, and this is the way to be holy, and this is fundamentally fully approved for all time that you should do things in this way. I think the reason it doesn't say that is because Jesus is to show us that way. But I think it's not an illegitimate move to wonder, because Jesus just gives us one instance in the Mosaic Law where it said you're allowed to do something, but it turns out that was really only for their hardness of hearts. Now you might say, okay, well, Jesus told you one instance. How do you get to apply that wherever you want? Well, I would say this is where, as a Catholic, I want to think with the church. And I think the church helps us to use that hermeneutic in various ways. Pope Benedict XVI talked a lot about it, and I think it's possible to apply it to other passages, not just to the divorce issue. So that's my stake. If you have a response to that, you can make it. But I also wanted to give you a chance, Dana, because of my extra 40 seconds at the beginning. Please forgive. If you wanted to make any other points that we haven't touched on yet, and then we could start transitioning into closing statements soon.
Sure. Okay, I just wanted to maybe follow up a little bit without repeating myself, but according to the Catechism's teaching on the sacrament of marriage, this faux marriage between the conquering warrior and the captive woman isn't a marriage at all. If you have no marriage, then Jesus is talking about divorce. So I just want to make that point. And then Jesus...
Wait, sorry, why is it not a marriage at all? You say because there's no consent?
Correct. That's the teaching of the Catechism. So that's not even my opinion. That's what's written in the Catechism, when it's explaining. And it's a lot of information there, but very clearly consent is part of it. So I'm coming from this as far as a practicing faithful Catholic, that this warrior and this woman are not married. This is just simply a man raping a woman. It's not his wife at all. The way
go back to this, just because we're bringing it up again, it doesn't say in the text, and she gave no consent, or she had no consent. It doesn't say that, right? It doesn't talk about her consent at all, or lack of consent. It just doesn't mention it.
Well, it doesn't say that she gave consent. I think, I've already kind of talked about my bit on why I think that this is non-consensual. I did have something else to add about Jesus. I already kind of talked about Mark 10. But listen, the Christians have this deep bias which reduces their objectivity in evaluating Jesus. Just Christians can't fathom that he might have made mistakes or not known things, but I believe that Jesus makes quite a few mistakes. In John chapter 2, the famous wedding at Canaan scene, if you read that closely, some of those people are already slightly under the influence of alcohol where they can't tell the difference between a good wine or a bad wine, and Jesus is giving them more wine to drink. That's questionable judgment in my mind. Then Jesus... he makes some very ignorant statements about the cosmos and about personal hygiene. And probably most importantly, in a hotly debated topic that has whole books written on it, is Jesus' ministry got an awful lot of people to believe that the imminent arrival of God's kingdom was going to come in their lifetime and they were going to see it personally. And he simply was mistaken on that particular point. So Jesus is fallible. In my viewpoint, and I think to be objective, you have to consider that he's capable of making mistakes just as anyone else is capable of making mistakes. So I guess that's just kind of what I had prepared. You did mention... go ahead.
Well, yeah, so I disagree with that, obviously, as a Christian. Right. I don't think Jesus is fallible. I would say with the wedding wine at Cana, it's up to he's just supplying wine that has run out. If people choose to have too much of it, or if people don't help them out so that they shouldn't have too much of it, that's on them, that's not on him. Teachings about the cosmos, I don't think he's intending to teach scientific truths about the cosmos. And then, yes, his predictions about the end of the world and discussion of that is detailed in Matthew 24 and also in, I think it's Mark 12. And we've talked about it a little bit on the podcast. But I think there are ways to interpret that where he's talking about two different layers of meaning. One is about the end of the world as they know it with the sack of Jerusalem in AD 70. And two is about that eschatological coming on the clouds of the kingdom. But this will take us too far afield to go into
it's
little
totally
statements.
Another topic.
I just wanted to say I disagree with those. And there was one more point I wanted to come back to that I think that you made, but I forgot. Oh, yeah, that's sorry. About the 1,000 years, and then we'll go into closing statements, because you said that was incompetent judgment over the 1,000 years. Well, I'll say the Torah. Yes, Torah is very ancient, but the Torah wasn't God's last word on the issue. And if you read through the prophets, a lot of times what you find is that the prophets are railing against God's own people for not loving their neighbor as themselves, for not acting as their own. So I do think that God continued to speak mainly through prophets. There's also oral tradition. As a Catholic, I don't believe in sola scriptura. I believe that God's word is preserved in both scripture and oral tradition. And so I think God continued to speak even after the Torah down until the time of Jesus, when we get a more fuller teaching on Christian morality. But we've talked about a lot, Dana, and I don't want to let the discussion get too unwieldy. Are you okay to move into closing statements, and you can kind of add any points that you want to come back on in there?
Sure. I was going to add a point on the prophets, and then
go ahead. Yeah, add a point on the prophets. So
it's not much of a point, but I'm focused on the prophet Ezekiel. He makes these claims. He's getting this divine dictation that he's writing down. And if you read the 16th chapter of Ezekiel and you read the 23rd chapter of Ezekiel, these are the most sexually violent books in the entire Bible, and they really are quite horrific. And I completely understand that they're allegories for the sins of Jerusalem. I understand all that. But when you look at the content, the prophets seem to be psychotic some of the times when they're writing this stuff. I did want to push back on this idea, though, that you said that chattel slavery, you mentioned chattel slavery, and that was not allowed in Israel. I think this is easily to disprove. The Deuteronomic laws only protected fellow Israelites from lifelong slavery. But if you read Leviticus 25, 44 through 46, or Deuteronomy, which is literally on the same biblical page as the captive bride verses, chapter 20, verses 14 through 18, it verifies that conquering Israelite warriors were authorized to subject women and children into lifelong lives of chattel slavery. They're taken as plunder or summarily murdered on the battlefield. And so people can just read those Old Testament scriptures. And so I don't believe that's true. And I wanted to make that point. However, for the captive bride, she cannot be subject to lifelong slavery because she's technically an Israelite when she goes through these things. So she gets the benefits of being an Israelite, which could be significant. Yeah, I also want to say that you didn't bring this up, but I wanted to bring it up that, everybody's talking about how she gets to go free if the warrior is unsatisfied with her. Well, I really don't think she gets to go free. She's actually abandoned. I mean, her people are dead. It's been 30 days since her head was shaved. She's been raped, in my opinion. I understand you don't agree with me that. Some of these women could even be pregnant with the warrior's child. And what are they really going to do to survive? I think they're going to have to start begging for food. They might have to sell themselves into slavery, which for them, being Israelite citizens, would not be lifelong, become prostitutes. But I really don't think anybody would be surprised if some of these women just simply threw themselves off of a cliff based on their current predicament that the warrior put them into. I don't know.
Which you would say the text acknowledges that, by the way, right? When it says, and you have humiliated her. It's at least saying that the warrior who does those horrible things that you were just by sending her away, humiliates her. And the code tells him that. And so therefore the law of God is at least convicting him in some sense to say, anyone who does this has humiliated.
I see. You're saying that humiliated word is really more about the warrior being what it says. Bad guy. Yeah, no, I see your point.
Since you have humiliated her. Yeah.
Yeah, but
he has humiliated her. Sorry. But what I'm saying is the text is calling him out in at least that small respect and saying the one, which is, in other words, to say he shouldn't do that because if he does that, he's humiliating her. And that's not how God's people should treat other people. But as you're saying, well, there's other laws. The slavery issue, it's a whole other topic. We talked about it a little bit one time. The reason I say chattel slavery, though, is that it's not chattel slavery, is not having to do with the lifelong aspect of the servitude, but more of the reduction of the person to mere property who can undergo very, very harsh punishments without repercussions in an unrestrained way, much like we had in the South. What servitude looked like under the Mosaic covenant, although again definitely not ideal, I think had a lot of restrictions and regulations that would make it better than some surrounding cultures, and ultimately there's no place for it in the new covenant with Jesus' teachings. I would say a lot of the similar things about slavery that I am about this passage, but we'd have to go into the slavery details to get into those specific regulations. But the reason I said chattel was not the lifelong aspect, but has more to do with how the person is reduced and how they're allowed to be punished and whipped and so forth without repercussion or restraint. But we've talked about a lot of stuff. One of the things actually I am curious to ask you is how important you think these kind of dialogues are. And then maybe we'll go into closing statements, because I will say some people, even in my camp, will say it's not really useful to debate or quibble about Old Testament laws or restrictions, because that's very downstream from the bigger ideas like, does God exist? And is Jesus his only son? And should we place our faith in Jesus who rose from the dead and has taught us the law of love and has promised to raise us up again. Shouldn't we be focusing on that first? And then if we have that in place, well, then, okay, yes, we'll come up with some ways to understand these passages as best we can. So I'm curious, in light of that, how important do you think dialogues like this are? And then we'll get to our closings.
Sure. I guess I have like two answers. The first one, my wife is this deep believing Pentecostal Christian woman who knows that Jesus is her Savior because the Holy Spirit has made it abundantly clear to her that that's true. She's not Catholic, but it's a matter of common sense. There's no question about it. So she would exactly say that. Who cares about all these Old Testament things? I mean, that's got nothing to do with anything. So that would be, my very own wife's attitude, who I just love dearly, is that none of this matters. To me, it really does matter. I think to you, it really does matter too. I'm going to speculate that you get irritated when you hear some skeptic going, "Oh, the Bible authorizes rape." That's a very big charge to make. And I get irritated when I hear an apologist saying, "No, the Bible condemns rape." It's my view that when you have these real deep scholarly, hopefully deep scholars, here I am tooting our horns, maybe we're just a couple amateurs, but you have these discussions, my opinion is the Bible is a bit convoluted on rape. Sometimes, it appears to authorize it, and other times it does not appear to authorize it. So these discussions kind of, weed those different things out, and without them, you have these, kind of ninth grade arguments of the Bible authorizes rape. No, the Bible could, and where are we really going from that? I guess that's my answer to your question.
All right. Is it okay if I start I'll give a little closing statement, Dana, and then I'll kick it over to you for the final word?
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we've been going about an hour, and that's kind of settled on. All right. First, I want to thank Dana for the lively and important exchange. I know there's a lot of rabbit trails we can chase, but I'm just going to try to summarize some of my opening remarks again, and maybe just state where I think the evidence can take us next. But in my opening statement, I argued for two principles. First, that our worldviews will greatly influence how we understand the text. And as a Catholic Christian, I'm going to give the scriptures a more favorable reading than an atheist is going to do. And I think as long as a possible favorable reading is available for a particular passage, then the argument against its inspiration doesn't work. And then my second, the favorable reading of this passage takes into account the historical cultural context and affirms that God used a principle of mitigation to set up boundaries around the dealings of Israelite men and captive women, and that Jesus' remarks about divorce in the New Testament cue us into the fact that a principle of mitigation was sometimes used. And if it's sometimes used, and I think its usage in Deuteronomy 21 is plausible, especially given my further point that if the text were merely human, one might not expect those restrictions of a 30-day waiting period and making the woman unattractive. Additional evidence, we had a major disagreement over whether the text authorizes rape or sexual assault or misconduct. I don't find that to be the case. And the reason is, one, the text never says that the woman is given no chance to consent to the arrangement. And then there's another piece of evidence. I know we didn't really have a lot of time to discuss it, so I won't belabor it. But in Exodus 22, it talks about if a man who seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall give her the bride price and make her his wife. But if the father utterly refuses to give her to him, he still has to pay the money anyway. That's in Exodus 22, verses 16 to 17. And so what I see there is evidence that if the father could utterly refuse to give the woman to a man who seduced her, I would argue that if that's the case, this captive woman, unfortunately, her parents have deceased. Maybe her father, maybe situations back then were more like arranged marriages where the father would have a lot of say in who the woman would marry. But with the parents deceased, I think it's plausible that this utter refusal that takes place in Exodus 22 would still be possible. And who would make the utter refusal? Well, it would have to be the woman herself. I don't see any reason in the text to reject the possibility that the woman could have utterly refused the arrangement if she wished, and then she would have just been a captive woman a lowly member of society of that time. Again, this is all non-ideal. And although it's not ideal, I think it's a step in a better direction than it could have been. And to help explain that, I'm going to close with a quote from an article written by Jimmy Akin on the principle that I've defended called the principle of mitigation. And he says, quote, "The church understands God to have taken the Hebrew people at one stage of their development and progressively led them through the centuries to a more perfect understanding of his will. At the early stage, he tolerated practices that the people would not have been willing to give up, but he progressively purified them. At first by regulating the harm done by these practices, and later by abolishing them, giving us the new law of Christ, which is based on love of everyone, including one's enemies." End quote. And that's what I see going on in the passage of Deuteronomy 21.
Yeah, okay, very good. I'm just going to be really short because I don't want to get into any more debate. I just want to, be thankful that I was even here today at all. But I really think that you're misreading Exodus 22 by quite a bit. This whole business is about that woman is a piece of property, and that she's no longer a virgin means she's no longer a valuable piece of property. And when you really start to look at these things, that's what this is really about, having to pay money when she's not a virgin. It's about property, and it's about damaged property. But, I got to say what I wanted to say. I thought that the discussion was really good. I'm not sure I proved anything here. I don't know what an unbiased jury would have to say. That's up to the unbiased jury. I didn't expect to convince you of anything. But I really want to thank you for, engaging. I find that Catholics are willing to talk to skeptics, and they're willing to be respectful and listen and have good conversations. And I don't know that that's always true. And sometimes skeptics have a problem with being polite. But also in our exchange, I found out that you're a dad. And, I think that's just fabulous. Your little one has a fantastic Catholic name. And I'm going to commit that I am going to read up on the saint that she's named afterwards so that I at least have that information. And I really wish you and your wife and your little one's future siblings all the best.
Thank you very much, Dana. And yeah, for the audience, I don't mind saying it, but my daughter is Catherine.
Yeah, I didn't want to, out her.
Okay, yes.
That's you,
And you can check that out. And no, this was a very interesting discussion. Yeah, like I said, we could chase down Exodus 22, Deuteronomy 24, 21, and we could talk about more of the particulars, but I think we've started a discussion on a difficult topic. Like you said, maybe we're not both Old Testament scholars. Maybe we're just some studious amateurs here trying to make our best case, and hopefully the audience can then decide for themselves what they think about this issue. But thanks again, Dana, for joining me on the Classical Theism Podcast.
Yeah, happy 4th of July.
Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the debate. Stay safe.